Now Gita Gudarta Gauravam. So we are continuing with our reading and discussion of this holy text, Srimad Bhagavad Gita. And this particular edition, The Hidden Treasure of the Sweet Absolute, by our beloved Grand Guru Srila Sridhar Maharaj and Guru Srila Govinda Maharaj. So we are in chapter 2, and I'm going to start chanting from verse 54. Tita pragyasya ka basha samadhistasya keshava Tita di kim prabhasheta kim asita vrajeta kim Shri Bhagavanu vacha prajahati yadakaman sarvam partha manogatan atmanyevatmana tushta stita pragyasta dochyate Ukesh Vanudvignamanaha Sukeshu Vigataspraha Vitaraga Bhayakroda Stita Diamuni Uchate Yasarva Chana Vishnehas Tatat Prapya Shubha Shubham Nabhinandati Nadvishti Tasya Pragya Pratishtita Yada Samharate Chayam Kormangani Vasarvasha Indriyanindriyartebhyas tasya pragya pratishtita Vishaya vinivartante niraharasya dehina Rasavarjam rasopyasya param drishtva nivartate Yatato yapikunteya purushasya vipashtita Indriyani pramatini haranti prasabhammana Tani sarvani samyamya Yukta sita matpara Vashehi yasyendriyani Tasya pragya pratishtita Dhyayato vishayam pumsa Sangasteshu pajayate Sangat sanjayate kama Kamat krodo vijayate Krodad bhavati samoha Samohat smiti vibrama Smiti Brahmshad Buddhinasho Buddhinashad Pranashyati Ragadvesha Vimukhtaistu Vishayanindriyaischanam Atma Vasya Videyatma Prasadam Adhigachati Prasade Sarva Dukkanam Hanirasyo Pajayate Prasana Chetaso Yashu Buddhi Paryavatishtate Nashti buddhir yuktasya, nacha yuktasya bhavana, nacha bhavayanta santir ashantasya kutasukam, indriyanam yicharatam yanmanonu vidiyate, tadasya harati pragyam vayornavam vivambasi. Tasmad yasya mahabaho nigrihitani sarvasha, Indriyanindriyartebhyas tasya pragya pratishtita. Okay, I read quite a chunk there. Well, maybe I'll just finish almost at the end of the chapter. Yanisha sarvabhut, Simon 69. Yanisha sarvabhutanam tasyam jagati samyami yasyam jagrati bhutani sanisha pashyato mune. Apuryamanam machala pratishtam samudramapa pravishanti advat tadvat kamayam pravishanti sarve sashantam na kama kami vihaya kamanya sarvam pumam charati nishpriha nirmamo nirahankara sashantam adhigachati esha brahmi stiti parta nainam prapya vimuyati Stitvasyamantakaalepi brahmanirvanam richati ishi iti Srimahabharate Shata Sahasriyam Samhitayam Vayasikyam Bhishma Parvani Srimad Bhagavad Gita Supanishatsu Brahma Vidyayam Yoga Shastre Shri Krishna Arjuna Sambade Sankhya Yogo Nama Dityo Jayaha. So we've just heard the concluding verses of Srimad Bhagavad Gita. I'm going to back up now to verse 54, where Arjuna is posing this question to Sri Krishna. Arjuna said, "O Keshava, Krishna, what are the characteristics of the person of firmly established wisdom who is fully absorbed in consciousness of the supreme samadhi? How does such a man of steady mind speak, be, and act in this world?" The Supreme Lord said, "O Partha, one who rejects." So this is very nice, because on the one hand, hearing such a description, it may help us to recognize such persons, although they may be very rare, gives us some idea of what is the real standard, and also sometimes we come across persons who may pose as being a very elevated person, but their behavior may say otherwise. So how can we recognize such a person, genuine person? How do they speak? How do they act? And then one interesting thing, which isn't really explained here, but I've read this explained in the commentaries of our teachers, this be and then act, it's a little confusing. Let me see what it says in the word for word here. But one way in which I read this was explained by one of our teachers is that it's making a distinction between, like in particular circumstances, we choose to remain inactive, right? Like we don't allow ourselves to become disturbed. We know when to. I guess you could also draw upon Shakespeare's famous line, right? To be or not to be. Like, meaning like, when do you make an issue out of something and when do you not? That's the meaning there. Like, when do you silently accept, tolerate, and when do you come up and show a reaction? Because the enlightened soul, sometimes there's this stereotype about spiritual persons that they're just always passive. And according to some conceptions, that may be the case. But for example, in Buddhism, there's more of that's more what the goal is moving towards, like total detachment from all desire and all activity. But Vaishnavism, the path of devotion is different. The idea is that in the interest of the higher plane, in the interest of a higher cause, then we may show anger. Like Chaitanya Daya has Lord Nrsingadev's image on her profile here. And Lord Nrsingadev is a wonderful example about that. Chintamani's humbly requesting devotees to turn their cameras on. If possible. It is nice to see beautiful faces of our friends here. Actually, I made a podcast about this. I called it An Angry Divinity. Like, how do we accommodate this? Because Nrsingadev, for those who aren't familiar, is half man, half lion form of the divinity. And he comes in a mood of divine anger. But why? Is this just some uncontrolled, bodily urge? No, it's coming in response. It's an expression of devotion. It's an expression of love. And out of love, we may show anger. Out of a mood of protection, we may show anger. Okay, Chaitanya Dai, no problem. I'm fine with multitasking, but if you feel shy, then no problem. And welcome, our Lua has also joined us from the kitchen in Campos Dojo Dao, I believe. Welcome, happy to see you there. And also Dana, welcome Dana. And Govinda Nandini is also with us today. Nice, from Brazil also. So Lord Narasimha, half man, half lion avatar. He comes in this mood of anger, but it's an expression of spiritual love. So there's this distinction that needs to be made between uncontrolled, mental urges and something that's coming from a higher plane of pure spiritual love. So then how does such a person, like, how do they like act in like a physical and manifest way, and how do they like withdraw? Like the realized person also, they can do both. They know when to, like, I'll give you one very nice, this is also a nice example. Our Guru Dev, Srila Govinda Maharaj, who we consider to be a fully enlightened soul. He's known for his intense mood of love and affection. And for the most part, he had a very calm and collected demeanor. But sometimes out of his love for his service and for his guru and for the mission that he was doing in certain situations, and he may have shown anger, right? And there was this one incident, one of the persons who was acting as a doctor to our guru and was like a nurse, a doctor, and checking on him and helping. This was in his later years when he was not showing such good health. And there was one occasion where there was one incident that, someone who was making some disturbance in the temple, and our guru, Srila Govinda Maharaj, he became very angry. And I believe he might have even like thrown something in the room. And then this is Kishori. Some of you may know her, Kishori. She's a trained nurse. And she was concerned for his health, because normally if someone's health is fragile, to get into an intense emotional state, it's, it can be very risky, it can be dangerous. And so she went like to do a checkup on him right afterwards, and she checked I believe it was his blood pressure, and she's expecting it to be super high. It was exactly the same. His blood pressure was at completely normal levels. And this is immediately after, like moments after he'd just shown this, like powerful display of anger. Any ordinary person, their blood pressure would have gone way up. It was exactly the same. So he was showing this sentiment, but it wasn't coming from a material plane of emotion and aggression and ordinary anger. It was actually an expression of love, and it was coming from a spiritual platform. So it's a completely different thing. These persons, they're in control, right? If they're showing anger, that's with purpose, and if they're not showing anger, that's also with purpose. So whatever they're showing, they're under control of that. It's not that they're subject, they're being controlled by their senses, by their urges, by their mind, but they've mastered all these things. And if they're showing these things which are ordinarily considered negative, it's with some purpose, some higher purpose. It's interesting, Srila Sridhar Maharaj, he points out in one place that the Sanskrit word for freedom, it's swadhinata, and the meaning of that is self-mastery, to have mastery over the self. This is considered to be freedom. Not that we are under the control of our senses and mind and bodily urges, and we can do whatever we want, whenever we want, however we want, but that we've mastered these things, and we don't need anything of the outer world. No, this is true freedom. So our Gurudev was like that. He was in control of whatever expressions were coming from him. So when to speak, when to show something, and when to not show something. This is what's being mentioned here. Oh yeah, so then the other point I wanted to make is that, Arjuna is asking here, how can we recognize, how can we identify such a person? And then the other point here, which is interesting and helpful, it's like it gives us some type of benchmark as to what do we want to try to move towards, right? in the example, because we like, it's like a role model, right? It's helpful to have a role model, someone who's ahead of us to some degree or another. Doesn't need to be a lot, it may just be a little bit, but it's like something that helps us to stretch. Like, draw me a picture here of what I should try to aspire for, what I should try to move towards. So on both of these counts, this is a helpful discussion. What are the characteristics? What are the symptoms of an enlightened person who's fully situated in higher consciousness, detached from the outer world? And now Krishna begins. The Supreme Lord said, "O Partha, one who rejects all desires that enter the mind and remains self-satisfied within is known as a person whose wisdom is firmly established. One who rejects all desires that enter the mind and remains self-satisfied within." Because when we are in a lower conditioned, we use this, Kana Kalatas joined us, welcome. That. When we're in a more conditioned state, we like to use this phrase, meaning under the influence of the material lower energy. When we're in more of a conditioned state, then desires may enter the mind and we identify with them and we come under the control of those things. But for someone who's at a higher stage of advancement, and one interesting point here is that Krishna is not necessarily describing someone who's fully enlightened, right? They may still observe the play of desires within their consciousness, but they're detached from them, right? So they're not, the person being described here is not necessarily at the highest level of evolution, but somewhere higher up along the path. So Krishna is saying this person, these desires may enter the mind, but they will reject them. They will not allow themselves to be controlled by these things. They don't identify with this play of the mind and the senses. And they remain self-satisfied within. They feel that higher fulfillment within their own self. Because the soul by nature is self-satisfied. There's one phrase used in the scriptures, a well-known expression, means Atma Rama. Atma means the self, the soul. Rama means pleasure. So Atma Rama means someone who's finding pleasure within the self, within the soul within. Because the soul is by nature Ananda, right? Joyful. And so the more that we begin to feel, the more we come in contact with that inner Atma, the more the outer layers start to become stripped away, then the more we'll feel this higher satisfaction, fulfillment within ourselves. It is within. And so the more that soul self begins to arise, the more we will feel we don't need to get enjoyment from so many external sources. It is within my own self. Then going on to 56, one who is Krishna's continuing, one who is undisturbed by sorrow, whose hankering for pleasure has gone, and who is free from attachment, fear, and anger, is known as a silent sage of steady mind. Undisturbed by sorrow, hankering for pleasure has gone, and free from attachment, fear, and anger, is known as a silent stage of steady mind. I'm just looking, this is a really old copy I have, and I have trying to decipher. I have some notes here, trying to decipher on my notes. A silent stage of steady mind. I've mentioned in my notes here, Jada Bharat. So that's interesting. So Jada Bharat, some of you probably know that story. He was a great king who he had everything. He had so many beautiful wives and wealth and power. But at a certain point, he became dissatisfied with everything, and he decided to devote his life to spiritual culture and evolution. And so somewhat prematurely, he gave up his kingdom when he was still at a relatively young age. He gave up his kingdom and he went to reside in the forest and lived a life of great simplicity and simply absorbed in spiritual practice. But then what happens, interestingly, is towards the end of his life, he became obsessed with this baby deer. There was a baby deer who became separated from her mother. And so this King Bharat, he felt very protective towards this deer, which is, fine, of course, but it came to the point of a obsession. And so he was like always thinking about this deer and taking care of this deer. And then eventually when it came time for him to leave his body, he was thinking about that deer. And so in his next life, he took birth as a deer. However, because of his spiritual practice, he had some power, and he had the consciousness of a human, and he could remember his previous life. And so therefore he lived in this awareness that he'd messed up. And so he was, in his life as a deer, he was very careful to try to be absorbed in spiritual thought as much as possible. And there was an ashram of sages in the forest, and he would stay very close to them and hear their talks and take their prasad, their holy food, and trying to stay aloof from ordinary animal matters. And so then in his next life, he was born again as a human in a Brahmin family, I believe it was, but maybe not Brahmin, I'm not sure. But anyway, he was born to a human family, and they were involved with agriculture. And he still had this gift of being able to remember his previous lives. And so he was very, very cautious. He did not want to waste a moment of this precious human birth. And so and I think this is the connection that I'm drawing here, that he pretended to be kind of stupid, so that he didn't have to engage with all the frivolous conversations that persons would normally engage in. And so so he did not respond. People thought he was almost dumb, and he would not speak most of the time. Or maybe not even any of the time. I have to double check, but he was considered to be practically mute. And I think the connection I'm drawing here is that he withheld, right? He held within himself. He did not respond to so much stimuli of the mental sensory world. He held what he had within. He did not react or project in any way in the outer environment. And this was to such an extent that he became known as Jada. Jada means dull. It's also a name for the material energy, like heavy material energy, dull, like dull-headed, dumb-headed person. People called him that, Jada Bar. They just thought he was stupid, but he was actually extremely wise, and he was just holding it within himself. And there were some other interesting pastimes that took place with him. One of the more famous ones is that one time he became abducted by these worshippers of the goddess Kali, and people like to offer they do animal sacrifice, which they offer to her. But they thought, oh, if we do a human sacrifice, then she'll be really happy with us. And they thought, oh, this man is just like an idiot, we can easily get away with it. And so they abducted him, and they brought him before this deity of Ma Kali, and they were getting ready to cut his neck. And he did not resist at all. He was so firmly situated in spiritual consciousness that he did not feel any fear, and he saw the Lord's hand. He saw God's hand behind everything. So he thought, what need is there to resist? The Lord, everything's coming from the Lord. Of course, this isn't something we imitate, but we can appreciate someone living on such a high platform of faith. And so he made zero resistance. But then what happened is the deity of Ma Kali, she could recognize this is a great devotee of Lord Vishnu. And so her deity became, activated, and she came and she killed those men, and she protected Bharat, this Jana Bharat. So anyhow, there are some interesting stories connected with him. But yeah, it's interesting, and I see Ramasrup also made a comment here. We've had quite a few more joined. Charu Damodar has also joined us. Dandavat, Charu Damodar. Great to see you. Seva Rupa has also joined us. Dandavat from South Africa, welcome. So yes, it's an interesting thing, right? Because normally, and this is also mentioned in Upadeshamrita, this important text, the nectar of instruction. Oh, Prema Sindhu Prabhu, what an honor. One of our leading members in South Africa. Dandavat, Prema Sindhu Prabhu. Oh, and also Bhakta Jim is with us. Welcome, Bhakta Jim. Quite a few have joined today. Wow. Welcome, Bhakta Jim. So this is mentioned in some of you know, of course, this is a famous text by one of our teachers, Rupa Goswami, called Upadeshamrita, the nectar of instruction. And the first verse is outlining the 6 bodily urges. Vacho Vega, they're called Vega. Vega means urge. Vacho Vegam, Manasa Kroda Vegam, Jiva Vegam, Udaropashta Vegam. So the first urge mentioned here is the urge to speak. Vacho Vegam. And then urges of the mind, urges of anger, urges of the tongue, which is referring more to the tasting urge to taste, urge of the belly, and urges of the genitals. So these are the 6 principal urges that affect the conditioned souls of this world. So the urge to speak, this is very strong within us, right? It's very strong within us, right? And sometimes it's embarrassing when I reflect on myself, how often something wasn't really needed to be said, right? But we feel that urge, I need to say this, or I need to establish this point, when it wasn't really the right moment. There wasn't really necessity for it, or nobody really cares anyway. But I need to, for my own ego, I need to say this. It needs to come out, Or there may just be that urge to, just ramble, just ramble with no purpose, So it's very strong within us, the vacho ve, the urge to speak. It's a difficult thing to get away from. And I was reflecting, I think it was just yesterday or the day before, how our Gurudev, Srila Govinda Maharaj, he did not suffer from that urge at all, and everything he said was on point, was purposeful. And because of that, when he said something, everybody paid attention. Because I was thinking how often in our conversations we feel this need to repeat ourselves 2 or 3 times. It's almost like sometimes we need to do that, or we think we need to do that in order for the other person to really hear us and what we're saying. It's like we feel like we need, it's like there's two, often it's like two people, and to some extent, I'm not saying all the time, but often, at least to some degree, there's an element of talking at one another. And there's that feeling that we need to repeat ourselves a few times, or feeling like we haven't really been heard. But our Gurudev, because he was so precise and purposeful with everything that he said, when he said something, everybody paid attention, everybody was taking notes, everybody remembered that, holding on to that in their memory, they're recording that. It was like everything, he could say one word and we would remember it years afterwards. We're still remembering it because everything he said was so purposeful. And he wouldn't repeat himself. Even one thing I noticed was that, because I was going through many of his lectures during his world tours, and I came across some, like, there are some things he said, some really cool things he said, or cool stories that he told, and he only told them once, and like some of these, like just a few days ago, one of our brothers, Chinmoy, he sent me a recording of this really interesting story that our guru told him. Let's see, Bhakti Jim says, waiting for the other person to finish so we can then pounce on the conversation with our point. Yes, exactly. Absolutely. I'm definitely guilty of that. Yeah, it can be really sad sometimes, because it's like you feel like, wow, is anybody listening to each other? Because it can't be like that. Like, say we're saying our piece, and the other person has something in their head they want to say, but then by the time we finished our piece, what they have to say, it's not really relevant anymore. But there's still that need, that urge, as you said, like to pounce in, and I do it too, I'm sure. So yeah, it's just interesting, isn't it? The urge to speak, like it's a thing. It's not coming from the soul, it's a bodily urge, coming from the ego, actually. And then because of that, and then that's the thing then, because a lot of the time we're speaking without purpose, without real purpose, or it's just coming from our ego, then we don't take each other so seriously all the time, right? Whereas with our Gurudev, if everything was so purposeful, so we paid attention. And so yeah, this was one thing that I observed, that there were some things that he said he wouldn't repeat. Of course, like his main preaching points, there were certain things he would repeat and emphasize because they were, primary in what he wanted to convey. But if they weren't, then he might mention them once or twice, and that would be it. And that was something I noticed, like listening to some of his talks in early world tours, like in the 90s. There were some things and some of them I was thinking to myself, like, wow, this is so amazing, like the way he explained this, or this story example he told, like, why didn't he tell it later, and I was thinking, like, he didn't feel the need to repeat that, and he didn't want to, like, there's so much more he has to say too. He doesn't need to repeat it so many times. But he gave it then at that time, it was perfect at that time. And whoever is lucky to hear that, then they're just lucky to hear that. And if you didn't hear that, then you didn't hear that, and that's okay. But he's just giving it once, and that's it. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. When we become more purposeful, if we become more purposeful in our speech, then the more will actually be heard, right? Then the more persons will pay attention, because that will start to be seen. Oh, when this person speaks, they're not just speaking at random, but they're speaking purposefully. Then there will naturally be given more space to that person. Oh, I want to hear what they have to say. So it's a really interesting and relevant, always relevant reflection. Does anyone else want to share anything on that? Or should we move on?
Haribol.
Haribol.
You know how there's
Jim?
yeah, Haribo, please accept my humble obeisances. Dandavats to the assembled devotees. You know how there's the 6 opulences that Krishna possesses in full, all beauty, all fame, all wealth. Well, at very, very rare times in my life, very few times I've actually been able to, I don't know how I did it, but remain silent. And the longer I was silent, the more I attracted people to like, what's going on? You know, they hover, they come in, they want to know why I'm being silent. So is that because Krishna possesses the opulence of renunciation? So could that be a form of renunciation of the urge to speak? And therefore that's attractive to people. Is that what's going on?
I love that connection. I think that's a really cool connection. That makes sense to me.
Like my wife and I sometimes, because we're both teachers, right? And it's perfect. Krishna has this way of pairing up people who can really help each other evolve, really in an accelerated way. And I'm very grateful for it. But in the beginning of the marriage, I used to get so frustrated, like, you haven't read any of these books, you know? And so I would try to do all the faux pas of trying to convert somebody like a fool, right? Now I've learned that if I can just sit and really, like you said a minute ago, actively listen with affection. And instead of spite or I'm going to prove this to you, or actually, like, then I start learning stuff too. And it went from I don't want to know anything about bhakti to can we chant again now? So we now we're having kirtans together after 7 years, you know.
Wow, amazing.
and there's a devotee who has it's called Nightlight Astrology, Achutya Babadas. He's a great devotee. I really like him, and he has this astrology channel, and he just addressed this topic of when your significant other or your friends or your parents or your siblings could care less about your spiritual path and how to deal with that in a very enlightened way instead of like the proselytizing, you know. So this urge to speak thing, I actually, when I was in college, I spent a whole day, I didn't talk. I was silent for 1 day. So longest I've ever gone, because I'm a real chatterbox. And so this is like a key to not only world peace, but everything else that we want that's favorable in the world is this ability to listen. And so this Nectar of Instruction is a super powerful book in that regard, the first verse, you know. So I always come to your sanghas when you're like addressing, of course they're all great, but they always seem to be just what I needed to hear. So it's magic. Thank you.
Yeah, there's some type of synergy going on here. It's cool.
Yeah, very useful, and I very much appreciate.
We really appreciate your presence and your contribution always, Dr. Jim. And then you also brought up an important related point. Those weren't my words, those were your words. Actively listening with affection. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. That's the next point to discuss, isn't it? The value of really hearing others in a conscious way and with affection, as you said. And that actually puts you in a more powerful place to be heard as well, because then how you will respond to them will be more meaningful to them. You know, like I was well, I don't want to, I don't want to toot my own horn, but I think I consider myself to be a fairly good listener.
One of my mentor in Krishna consciousness was in the early movement in the like 67 on with Prabhupada. And a new devotee came on the next year who was very like just so bravado. And so Prabhupada says, this is the way to deal with him. He says, allow him to spool out completely without contradicting or trying to correct him. Let him completely express himself, get it all out. And then at the very when he's completely finished spooling out, you say, that is very interesting. I like that. But we can do this as well. And he says he will accept it immediately. He will accept if you allow him to completely vent, then you come in with the alternative. Exactly. He'll accept it.
Mm,
And so
mm,
he adopted that because Prabhupada had this magical way of
mm,
absolutely nailing every situation for everybody.
mm,
So
mm.
so I'll never forget that. It's like you got to let people
Yeah,
fully vent and express
yeah,
themselves, and again with care and concern.
yeah.
It's hard to do. Especially these days, there's so much polarization in the atmosphere. Really intense. So anyway,
Mm.
thank you.
Yeah, that's a very nice way of expressing it. That's a nice example of Srila Prabhupada to hear. And yeah, that's the policy that I try to apply. Like when I'm out kind of traveling, that's what I was going to say, and we're meeting a lot of people, and rather than being in this kind of aggressive spirit of trying to give people something, I really try to make an effort to hear them, and this is an important principle, only give advice if they ask for it. you know what's the expression?
Solicited.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you, Charadam. Unsolicited advice is never welcome. Unsolicited advice. And I recently, I had, this is kind of like just my general policy, but recently I had a few experiences which really brought home the importance of this, where it was on two different occasions and within the space of a few days. And these are two persons who have been like kind of like visiting, joining some of our programs, but not going in too deep yet. And I observed that one of the members in our group, like we were having some conversation, and this was two separate occasions, but it was the same pattern, where the new friends, like we're just having some casual conversation, and the new friends, share some of their gripes or opinion. And then one of our members kind of came in with unsolicitedly with some like kind of strong spiritual stance on that. And our new friend was completely put off by that on both occasions. And they liked, and they're smart. They were both quite sharp people too. So they had like good comebacks. And it just kind of like closed the conversation. But then, later, both of those persons, they came to me and they want to hear what's my opinion on. They're asking me, like, I want to hear what's your opinion on all these things. So it was a nice kind of like confirmation for me, like, yes, this is the approach, like when people are coming out with their stuff, just smile and nod. You don't need to come and hit the Bhagavad Gita over their head or whatever. Just be their friend, smile and nod. And if they ask you for advice, then you can tell it. If they ask you for your opinion, then you can tell. Then it becomes a meaningful exchange. Because otherwise they also feel disrespected if you're just immediately coming in with your own opinion. And often it's kind of like you're spouting in an encyclopedic type of way. Some people have this method. They're just like, spouting off some memorized thing, like this is the way it is, and they're not really sensitive to where the person is, not really hearing where they're coming from. So yeah, that's I think that's an important principle. When and if asked, and it's just like common, it's just human politeness, really. We can just take it on that level. That's a refined way of behaving. Like that's how more sophisticated people behave anyway. Anyone with some type of, training or knowledge of proper gentle dealings, they know these things, right? So yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point about listening. That's also very important. And really feeling, and not just like as a mechanism, but like, we want to genuinely care, right? We want to genuinely feel empathy and compassion. And that was the example that we saw with our guru also. He wasn't always on a preaching mission to save the world, but he could just be there for somebody and hear them and support them and give them affection. It wasn't that he's always quoting Bhagavad Gita verses, at them, but just in a like a human way, just being there, holding their hands, kind of thing. That can go so much further than preaching or spouting out the teachings. But just being their friend, caring for them, making them feel cared for and heard. That can go so far. So yeah, very nice points. Well, we went off topic a bit but it's all related. Anyone else want to add anything to that? Gangalila, I saw you unmuted yourself for a moment there. Did you want to say something?
I no, I don't recall, but I think that was whatever you were sharing is really important, because I feel like in my experience that I don't absorb enough of what's been shared and what's been said, what's been taught, when I am just ready to express my opinions and what I think and what I've been seeing. It's like there's more capacity to absorb when I'm not in the reply, react, comment, feedback, and what's that other thing? Advice. Yeah, that's it's really good that you brought that up. And I sit in these rooms of the Bhakti recovery groups. That's one of the things we always say when people share, that we don't want to cross-talk, we don't want to give unsolicited advice, and it's such a good one. It's good because we just learn to be really present with what is said instead of with my own opinion. Like, I should know my own opinion, so I don't need to exercise it all the time. You know what I mean? Yeah. No, I think I was just putting thumbs up. I didn't mean to unmute myself. Hare Krishna.
Oh, that was nice. And I like that point too, that when we're more in that mood of, not speaking or reflecting, we absorb more, right? Because things do, sometimes profound things can come and go in the course of the conversation. It just gets lost, whereas there may have been one point that you could just sit for hours and meditate on, right?
You know what also came to me? That's something I can't share. When you began speaking, like quite a few minutes ago, I was totally thinking about small children. First, they're babies and they just go, when they need something. But then they're toddlers and they don't speak. They don't speak until they're 2 or 3 years old. They're very quiet. They absorb so much. They learn so much, but they don't talk away. That comes later. They're they're amazing when they are not in that phase where they constantly speak. Like a 2.5-year-old person. It's an amazing silence they hold, because fully with everything, and they understand everything, but they don't even speak a language yet, but they understand everything. Like us, a long time ago, I was like that. You were like that. It's an ability.
That's a really good point, because that's just a known scientific fact that at that age, we absorb more. Our brains are more open to learning. We can learn at a much higher rate. It's like up to the age of 7, right? There's like a range, like 2 or 3 up to 7 years, something like that, when our brains are just operating at a different wave and we're able to absorb more. And yeah, in those earlier years, we don't speak very much. So yeah, that's very interesting. We're just absorbing. Interesting.
On that note about the miraculous qualities of devotee babies, devotee children. I've had so many experiences that have blown my mind with God brothers and sisters who have young devotee children. And like when I met one family, I was a high school teacher, and so I was always like expounding on something. And the little boy was 6 years old, and he would just look at me and he would go, "I know, Jim." Like there's nothing I could say that would surprise him, that would blow his, there was nothing that I could come up with or conjure that was impressive to him in any way, shape, or form. And it was just like, he would let me spool out and he would go, I know, Jim. I've had a 2 or 3-year-old devotee just walk up to me and start talking to me like an old man, like the wisdom of an elder. They're absolutely amazing souls that are born as children. You know, I'm sure you've all had experiences. Some of you probably have your own children, so or even grandchildren. But that is something I just wanted to chime in on, is with the experience of working with Karmi kids for years and years, and then finally coming into the exchanges of devotee kids. It's just like, it's very humbling. I'll say that.
You've reminded, thank you for sharing that. And you've reminded me of one story someone told me recently. One of the kids in the community where I am now in California, he's an amazing little boy. He's like around 6 or 7. But not too long ago, there were a group of our members. They were chanting the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, but he was being silent, wasn't chanting. And so somebody told him, "Oh, why aren't you chanting? Why aren't you singing with us? Why didn't you sing the Maha Mantra?" And the boy, his name is Ranajit, he answered like with a lot of like clarity and force. And he said, I don't chant the Maha Mantra. I listen to the Maha Mantra. I hear the Maha Mantra. He's like, it was very clear on what he's doing. I'm listening.
Shravanam.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. It's been a really wonderful discussion. Thank you all for your wonderful contributions. And anyone want to share any final thought before we end for today?
Yes, I would like to share something. Chintamani Devi Dasi, recovering codependent, aspiring devotee. We'd like to live stream these talks. If there's any kind soul who feels like taking up the service, rather than sending the Zoom replays to our WhatsApp chat group, our Bhakti Friends chat group, if any kind soul feels stable enough with their internet and their reliability to help us live stream this meeting so more people who can't make it can participate. Just wanted to share, and thank you so much for Shaka Didi. Thank you so much, Ganga Leela, for hosting today. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's so lovely to tune in and study the Bhagavad Gita with you all. Dandavats.
Okay, well, thanks, Chintami. Let's see if we can work that out. And also, I wanted to say that I have a mini announcement too, that I'm planning to go to India. I think the beginning of February, before it gets to March, is going to be very crowded because it's the appearance of Lord Chaitanya, and I'm planning to go at the beginning of February or sometime in February. And if anyone wants to come with me, I'd be very happy. And I'd love to, show some friends around. Then I also feel like I'm, not just, selfishly enjoying a visit to India, but it'd be nice to feel useful too. So if anyone wants to meet me there or come with me, then I would love that. So yeah, and we're only we're in June now, so there's some time to think about it and plan and save up money and all of that, and then I can organize the accommodation and the route. And this will be only Bengal though. I don't think I'll make it over to India. Over to Vrindavan, but I'm talking about in Bengal, the birthplace of Lord Chaitanya would be that. I think probably just that part of India, but I'm open to expanding if there are others who really would like to travel to another area too. So just throwing that out there. And yeah. Okay, well, okay, cool. Yeah, you can, Chaitanya, I have a few comments here in the chat. Okay, awesome. Great. Ganga Leela, will you pray us out for today?
Thank you so much, Vishakaridi, for sharing your insight, for your time, for your love, for your dedication. May this uplift us not only for the rest of the day, but for the rest of the week. And may we absorb what we can and bring that into our mundane daily activities every moment. Keep the sadhana in the mundane, not just when we are meeting here. And then we can all unmute and chant 3 rounds of the Maha Mantra together. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Hare.
Haribo.
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 Thank
It
you.
was so
Thank
beautiful.
you.
Gangalia.
Very
Thank
beautiful.
you.
Thank you,
Sarah.
Shakadidi.
Thank you. Thank you, Shakti Didi.
Yeah. Jai Gurudev.
Thank you,
Jai
Gangalila.
Gurudev.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you, devotees and friends.
Haribo.
Haribo.
Sadhu
Haribo.
Sangha Maharaj ki jai.
Jai.
Haribo. Haribo.
Yay.